Week number 3 of the college football season is officially over, and boy was it a good one. So let's get into recapping and reacting to week number 3 of the college football season. So kicking off this week, we had Miami face off against a no-name school, and of course they absolutely destroyed them. However, what everyone was excited for was the Saturday games. And kicking it off on Saturday on Fox Big Noon, Illinois faced off against Penn State. And the Penn State Nittany Lions had to travel to Champaign, Illinois to take on the Fighting Illini. Many predicted this game as a sneaky upset spot for the Illinois Fighting Illini. However, this was not the case. Illinois' offense looked completely awful as they had 5 turnovers against Penn State and threw 4 interceptions. However, it wasn't all rainbow and sunshine for Penn State as their offense looked completely awful in this game, and Drew Aller had a rough time in his first road start. However, Penn State was able to take care of business as they would ultimately end up winning this game 30-13. Next up, we had a surprisingly close game between Florida State and Boston College. Many expected Florida State to absolutely destroy Boston College, however, this was not the case. Florida State's offense looked great in the first half, however, in the second half, things would completely change. Florida State's offense and defense would both go out the window as Boston College would begin their comeback. Boston College surprisingly started scoring touchdowns with their offense, and they ended up making this game a lot closer than expected as they would lose to the Florida State Seminoles 31-29. However, this was a surprisingly close game, and this looks really bad for Florida State. Next up, we had another matchup that we thought would be pretty close between LSU and Mississippi State. However, this would not be the case, and that is all due to that LSU offense. They finally played how we all knew they could, and they were firing on all cylinders as Jalen Daniels completely destroyed that Mississippi State defense. He would throw for 361 yards with 2 passing touchdowns and 2 rushing touchdowns, and would finish the game with a QBR of 95.6. And this was all that LSU team needed as they would end up defeating Mississippi State 41-14. Next up, we had the surprisingly best game of the week between Kansas State and Missouri. This game was an absolute bloodbath and an amazing back and forth game. However, I thought that Will Howard would be able to lead the Kansas State team to victory. However, it was actually Missouri's quarterback that showed up that day as he would lead the Missouri Tigers to victory 30-27. But I can't also forget that Missouri kicked the longest field goal in college football history, a 61-yard game-winning field goal to beat Kansas State. I'm trying to talk about most of the ranked teams. So next up, we had a rather poor game between Utah and Weber State. Of course, as we expected, Utah would take care of business as they would beat Weber State 31-7. And we're all just waiting to see how good this Utah team can really be when Cam Rising returns to this football squad. Next up, we had another snooze fest of a game between Notre Dame and Central Michigan. As we all expected, Central Michigan would not be able to hang with Notre Dame and that high-powered offense and that pretty loaded defense, as Notre Dame would ultimately come away with the victory in this game 41-17. And now we finally get to talk about some of the good games. And of course, we're going to kick this off talking about South Carolina versus Georgia. And this game was an all-out SEC classic. Spencer Rattler and the South Carolina Gamecocks played amazing in the first half of this game as Spencer Rattler led the Gamecocks to a 14-3 lead over Georgia heading into the half. However, this game would quickly change. Carson Beck would come out firing in the second half for Georgia, and he would lead them to score multiple touchdowns. And Spencer Rattler could not seem to get it going on offense as the Georgia Bulldogs would ultimately end up beating the Gamecocks 24-14. And next up, we might have had one of the worst games of the entire college football Week 3 slate as Alabama faced off against USF. I've already made a video discussing this Alabama quarterback problem, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but Alabama looked absolutely awful against USF. Nick Saban and Alabama benched Jalen Milroe after their last week loss to Texas, so this week they were starting a new quarterback in Tyler Buchner, and he absolutely looked awful against USF as the score was tied 3-3 going into halftime. And Nick Saban saw enough as he pulled him and benched him for Ty Simpson, the third-string quarterback, and he would lead Alabama to victory 17-3 over USF. Next up, we'll be discussing one of the Pac-12's finest in Oregon State. Oregon State faced off against San Diego State, and everyone expected Oregon State to take care of this game. And they did just that as they ended up winning this game 26-7. Next up, we have the high-scoring game between Tulsa and Oklahoma. Everybody expected Oklahoma to easily win this game against Tulsa, and they did just that as they would ultimately end up winning this game 66-17 with a high-powered offense. Next up, many thought that this was a trap game as Minnesota faced off against UNC. And North Carolina looked absolutely awful against Appalachian State, so many of the people thought that this could be a close game. However, Minnesota's defense could not stop Drake May and the UNC offense, as they would ultimately end up scoring 31 points and would win this game 31-13. And then we had another Big Ten versus ACC game as Duke would take on Northwestern. And Northwestern is one of the worst teams in the entire Power 5. And Duke has been looking good recently, so it's not a surprise that they would end up beating Northwestern 38-14. Next up, we'll be discussing Ohio State versus Western Kentucky, and boy was this a good one. Ohio State finally proved that they're elite as they ended up scoring 63 points against Northern Kentucky and finally proved that they have been one of the best teams in the country. And then we had a huge game between the Pac-12 and Big Ten. And if you couldn't already tell, this was the game between Washington and Michigan State. And many people surprisingly actually thought that this could be a close game, even without Michigan State having their head coach Mel Tucker. However, this would be anything but a close game, as Michigan State could not stop Washington's offense led by Michael Penix. And Washington would end up pounding Michigan State 41-7 in Michigan State Stadium. Next up, we had the most highly anticipated game of college football week number 3 between the Florida Gators and Tennessee Volunteers. And many people were actually skeptical of Tennessee and thought that they had potentially had a chance to lose this game against the Florida Gators. And that's actually what happened, as that Florida Gators atmosphere played an absolute pivotal part of this game, as Tennessee's offense under Joe Milton couldn't get anything going, and Florida would end up winning this game against Tennessee 29-16. Next up, Michigan faced off against Bowling Green, and basically everyone in the country expected this one to be a blowout. Bowling Green can just not match up with Michigan in that high-powered offense and that loaded defense, and Michigan would easily take care of business over Bowling Green in this game. And next up, we had Hawaii facing off against Oregon in this huge West Coast game. And as basically everyone in the country expected, Oregon absolutely dominated Hawaii, and their offense showed up under Bo Nix. And Oregon easily gets the blowout win over Hawaii in this one. Next up, Ole Miss faced off against Georgia Tech, and this game was actually close at one point. However, Ole Miss would pull away from Georgia Tech and prove that their offense is legit and one of the top offenses in the SEC, as they would ultimately end up winning this game 41-17. And then we had a big game between the Big 12 and the ACC when Pitt takes on West Virginia. And surprisingly, Pitt's offense could not get anything going, as West Virginia would end up winning this game 17-6. And next up, we had a big game between the ACC and the Big Ten as Syracuse takes on Purdue. And many thought that this game would be close, and it actually was, as Syracuse would end up coming away with the victory in this game over Purdue. And the final game of college football week number 3 is between Wyoming and Texas. And nobody thought that this game would be close, however, it actually was. And for a large part of this game, it was actually tied between Wyoming and Texas. And this is actually does not surprise me, as Texas just came off a huge win against Alabama and is probably playing pretty lackadaisical in this game. However, Texas needs to figure this out, as they could not slip up in the Big 12 this season. So that is week number 3 of college football recapped and reacted to. Make sure to like and subscribe, as I will be posting more videos this week.